Hello everyone, how are you? Today we're finishing this animated building. We're gonna add some background elements, light up the scene, create the materials, and choose our final camera settings. I'll show you how to render in both Cycles and Eevee so you don't have to worry about rendering times. I'll talk about some lighting concepts and we'll go through my chosen color scheme and how to pick a color combination that looks cohesive. Okay, let's begin. First, I'm gonna move the camera a bit, so select it, choose the view, and Ctrl-Alt-0 to align the camera to the view. I also want to center the building, and you can enable center under composition guides to know where the middle of the frame is. Let's move the camera a bit on the y-axis. And I'm also gonna adjust the passe-partout so I don't get distracted by whatever is outside the frame. Now we could add some extra elements since the building looks a bit too lonely. For this part, I prefer working in the animation workspace so I can have my camera view on one side and my viewport on the other. And let's set the origin to the word origin again and add a plane. Scale it and place it. Make sure the plane is close enough to the building. And now let's just make it real big so it occupies the whole frame. For the trees, I started with a cylinder for the tree trunk, and it took me a while to choose where to put each tree. I chose the placement according to what I thought looked better in terms of composition. I wanted the frame to look balanced, and I suggest you read a bit about composition techniques in film and photography. I added a few spheres on top of the cylinder. And as you can see, the tree is just a cylinder with 3 spheres. Then I simply duplicated the tree, I scaled it down a bit, and I placed it. And I repeated the process to add a third one. Then I decided to add another one, but I wanted this one to be way bigger since I wanted to place it on the opposite side of the frame to balance the composition a bit. Now let's move on to the lighting setup. I'm gonna hide everything but the camera and the lights, and before doing anything I changed the render engine to Cycles. Remember, I will show you how to render in Eevee later on, but I always check on the lighting in Cycles and in render preview mode. Make sure the lights and the world are enabled, and here I have this default light that you get in every Blender project. First, I'm gonna change the radius and the power. The larger the radius, the softer the light, hence you'll get softer shadows and the light will be a bit dimmer. So if you wanted to keep the same exposure after making a light bigger, you'll need to increase the strength. Let's open up this panel so you can see the placement of the lights, and as you can see, my light was to the side, which was giving me a pretty high contrast lighting ratio, which means one side is considerably darker than the other one, and I wanted something less contrasted to give this idea of a bright, happy place. And once I finished with that light, I added an area light and I placed it. I increased the strength. And let's take a look at the area light alone. As you can see, this light hits the building mostly, leaving the background a bit in the dark. I scaled this light up, and remember, this is gonna give us softer shadows. Okay, let's enable this light again, and while we are setting the lights, you can change the view transform to false color to control the exposure. For example, here on the roof we can see some orange or red colors, which means the lights might be too bright there. You should always read this according to the look you are going for, because if you're trying to create a dark or low-key scene, for example, then you might have too much cyan or blue, and if you read that exposure without that context, you might think that there's not enough light. Ideally, try not to underexpose or overexpose your image, because if you color correct it later, you won't have any information in those pixels to work with. Now, if you wanted less light to hit the roof, you can add a plane and use it as a flag. A flag is a device that blocks light. If you are using Blender 4, you can use light linking too. And as you can see, now there are parts of the roof that don't receive as much light as before. If your flag is visible in camera view, you can disable it here if you're in Cycles. And if you're in Eevee, you need to turn the flag's material into transparent and set the blend mode to alpha blend. Now, if we go back to false color, you can see that the orange color has disappeared, since we have less light hitting that part of the mesh. I didn't end up using a flag in my final lighting setup, by the way, and I made some other changes after setting the materials, but I'll show you that later on. Okay, now we can move on to the bokeh. First, we need to enable depth of field, and I chose 2 as my f-stop. And I set this window as my focus object. Originally, I did all of this while in render preview mode, but I usually avoid that mode while recording. To create the blurry circles, I added some spheres and I placed them taking my camera position into account. I placed some spheres closer to the camera and some others a bit further away from the camera, so some of the objects will be a bit more or less out of focus. And again, originally I did all of this in render preview mode, and it did take me a while, but you're just seeing the cleanup version of my process. I placed some spheres at the bottom and others at the top to create a bit of a balance between all the objects. And I also played with the size and the shape of the spheres. I added an emissive material to all of these spheres. I made this material quite bright, and I changed the white color to a slightly yellowish color. Let's take a look. Okay, before I show you the materials, let's take a second to analyze the color scheme I chose for this project. I wanted a complementary color scheme since it's usually visually appealing. There are plenty of very well used complementary color scheme examples, and I decided to go with one of the best known combinations, teal and orange. Keep in mind that brown is orange darker in value. After choosing my color scheme, I had to pick the exact shades, so I did a couple of color tests until I found the winner. Usually having one color dominating the frame and the other one working as a support will create a balanced scene. Try playing around with the brightness and saturation of the colors so they don't compete with each other. Also, try not to add too many colors since it's going to be too much visual information and your work probably won't look polished. So now, without further ado, let's take a look at the materials. Again, I suggest you do this in render mode so you can actually see how the shaders are looking, and remember to enable the lights, and if you're in Eevee, you may need to disable depth of field because it's a bit distracting as you can see. For the building, I started with a principled BSDF and I added a color ramp, a texture coordinate and a mapping node. Let's move the color stops. And first, I like setting the interpolation method to constant to get a clear idea of where the colors are, and that way it's easier to place them. And now we can choose the colors. and set the interpolation mode to linear to create a gradient shader. For the pipe, I changed the roughness, the specular and metallic settings. And I chose a blue color. For the trees, I also used a Principled BSDF and I chose a brown color. And since this was a cartoonish scene, I decided to make my trees a bit shiny by lowering the roughness, and I also lowered the specular a bit. And then for this big tree, I started by using the same material, but then I turned it into a single user because the shine that the other trees had didn't look good in this one. So I tweaked the specular and the roughness settings a bit. For the tree trunks, I used a Principled BSDF with all its settings at default, and I chose a dark material. For the background, I chose a blue color to keep up with my chosen color scheme. For the stairs, I chose the same material as the building. And then for this border, I went with the default color, but I did change some settings as you can see. Later on, I will show you another material you may use for the border, but this is the shader that I used for my final animation. For the roof, I used the same material as for the border, but I also added a second material slot. I assigned that new material to this face and I chose a pretty light yellow color. For both the door and the window frames, I chose a brown shade. As you can see, you don't always need to make complex materials to create a nice looking scene. As I just said, I used the door material for the windows as well. For the window slash, I added two material slots. For the first one, I chose a light brown color. And I also used this material for the side window frames. And then for what will be the glass, which is this middle face, I chose the second material and I went with a bluish color. I played with the specular and the roughness settings. Then I just had to copy the materials to all the other windows. And with all my windows selected, I went to edit mode so I could assign the glass material to all the windows faster. And now our side windows need the glass material as well. For the blinds, I made a new material and I chose a light color. For the chimneys, I chose the same material as for the border, which was just a white material. Okay, so for this material I wanted to create a warm edge material, which is gonna be visible in cycles only. I'm pretty sure there are some easy alternatives on YouTube using other nodes. For this material I used a bevel node, a geometry node, a vector math. I changed the vector math node to dot product, a color ramp and a mix node. I changed this mix node to color. I connected all the nodes. And I cranked the roughness and the sheen up. I chose a dark and a light blue. I set the color ramp to be a spline and moved the color stops until I liked how the effect looked. This effect is visible in render preview mode only. Let's see it in action. And the edges are a bit darker. The effect is pretty subtle, but you can always play with the placement of the color stops to get a more or less pronounced effect. And if you wanted, you could copy this node setup to add some color to the edges of this border, the chimneys, the roof, or any other mesh. We could pick 2 light colors, and if you get the blend file, you will find this node setup as well. And here we had the difference with and without that warm edge material in the border, the roof, and the chimneys. Back to the lighting setup. Since everything was looking darker than what I was looking for, I chose a white shade for the world color. And now the lighting is way brighter, and let's enable depth of field before rendering. I believe I chose 100 or 150 samples for the Cycles render. Remember to set your range, your format, and the output folder. And I recommend you first render a still image to see if the lighting and materials look fine, and then you can render the entire animation. And if your computer is a bit slow, you can always use ShipIt, or you can simply render in Eevee. But in order to make an Eevee render more appealing, we had to make some changes. First, let's change the f-top because it looked too blurred in Eevee, so I went with 4 instead. Then you have to enable contact shadows on every light object. I chose 200 samples and I enabled ambient occlusion, bloom, and a screen space reflection. Now you should take your time to see which settings look the best. For my final Eevee render, I only changed the bloom settings. And finally, I changed the shadow size to its maximum. And now we can hit render. I also made a square render. As you can see, I moved the trees around for a better composition. And we finished our animated building. I hope you were able to create this scene from beginning to end. Let me know if you like more videos like this one. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!